Imagine this. Iran still has its oil, its natural gas, its mountains, its 90 million people. Everything, except the Strait of Hormuz. Would Iran still be one of the Middle East's most influential countries? Or has one narrow waterway quietly shaped its entire modern history? Because by the end of this video, you might realize something surprising. Iran's greatest strategic advantage may not be buried underground. It may simply be where it sits on the map. To understand why, we have to forget everything we think we know about the Strait of Hormuz. Most people believe it's important because oil passes through it. That's true, but it's also completely missing the point. Oil is the consequence. Geography is the real story. Look at a map. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 50 kilometers wide at its narrowest. It doesn't look particularly impressive. Yet every year, trillions of dollars worth of trade passes through this tiny gap. Nearly 1/5 of the world's seaborne oil depends on it. That's already important. But here's what almost nobody talks about. The oil isn't what gives Hormuz power. The uncertainty does. Think about it. The strait has rarely been completely closed. Yet every time tensions rise, markets panic. Insurance premiums climb. Oil prices jump. Governments hold emergency meetings. Why? Because global markets don't wait for disasters. They react to the possibility of one. And that possibility exists because of geography. Now remove Iran from the equation. Imagine Iran's coastline ends hundreds of kilometers farther west. No islands overlooking the strait. No northern shoreline. No strategic position. At first, nothing seems different. Iran still exports oil, still has a large military, still has one of the biggest populations in the region. But then, the entire geopolitical picture begins to change. Without Hormuz, Iran loses something that can't be replaced. Leverage. Real geopolitical leverage isn't about controlling your own economy. It's about influencing everyone else's. That's exactly what strategic chokepoints do. They force the rest of the world to pay attention. Suddenly, every major power begins making different calculations. Would the United States maintain the same military presence in the Persian Gulf? Would China pay the same level of attention? Would Europe worry as much about instability in the region? But probably not to the same extent, because the world's energy lifeline would no longer run past Iran's front door. And that's only the beginning. If Iran never controlled Hormuz, its neighbors would probably have adapted decades ago. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf states would have invested much more aggressively in alternative export routes. More pipelines, more ports outside the Gulf, less dependence on a single waterway. In other words, Iran's geographic influence would slowly shrink. But here's the twist. This story isn't really about Iran. It's about how geography creates power. History is filled with countries that became influential, not because they were the richest or the strongest, but because they happened to control places nobody else could ignore. The Bosporus, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the Strait of Malacca, and the Strait of Hormuz belongs on that list. That's why governments spend billions protecting shipping lanes. Why navies patrol these waters? Why global markets react within minutes whenever tensions rise? Not because war is inevitable, but because geography doesn't give the world many alternatives. So, would Iran still matter without the Strait of Hormuz? Of course, it would still be one of the largest countries in the Middle East. It would still possess enormous energy resources. It would still play an important regional role. But would it command the same level of global strategic attention? That's a much harder question. Because sometimes, the difference between being an important country and becoming a geopolitical heavyweight isn't oil. It isn't military power. It isn't ideology. It's a few kilometers of coastline. And perhaps that's the most valuable resource Iran has ever possessed.